You are not living for yourself alone, and that truth is heavier than most people are willing to carry, because every choice you make is casting a shadow forward and backward at the same time, touching people you will never meet and people who already lived and died, hoping someone would break the cycle they couldn't escape. And whether you acknowledge it or not, your life is a relay race where the baton was placed in your hand long before you understood the rules of the game, long before you had language for pressure, responsibility, or purpose. And the mistake most people make is thinking this race is about personal comfort, personal happiness, personal success, when in reality, it has always been about continuation, elevation, and transformation, because bloodlines are not sustained by intentions, but by decisions, not by wishes, but by actions taken when no one is watching. And right now, there are sacrifices your ancestors made that you benefit from daily without even knowing their names. People who endured hunger so you could eat, who accepted silence so you could speak, who tolerated limits so you could dream beyond them. And if you sit with that long enough, it should make your excuses feel uncomfortable, because quitting is never private, giving up is never isolated, and settling never ends with you. It just passes itself down, dressed as normal, dressed as realistic, dressed as this is just how life is for people like us. Generations are depending on your decisions, even if they will never know your face, because the way you think today programs the environment tomorrow. The way you respond to pressure today becomes the standard your bloodline grows into. And whether you choose courage or fear, discipline or indulgence, responsibility or avoidance, those choices become patterns, and patterns become culture, and culture becomes destiny. And the reason this feels overwhelming is because deep down, you know you were never meant to live small. You were never meant to just survive, to just pay bills and pass time until life runs out, because survival doesn't require vision, but legacy does. And legacy demands that someone at some point decides to become the interruption, the one who says, this ends with me, the one who looks at pain and says, I will metabolize this so my children don't have to swallow it raw, the one who looks at lack and says, I will learn, build, grow, and stretch until abundance is no longer foreign in this family. You don't carry this weight because you are weak. You carry it because you are capable, because strength is often disguised as pressure and responsibility is often mistaken for punishment. But the truth is, if you were not built for more, life would not be asking more from you. And if you were not chosen to elevate the standard, you would not feel this restlessness in your spirit when you try to live average, when you try to blend in, when you try to shrink your dreams to make other people comfortable, because mediocrity is quiet, but purpose is loud. And purpose keeps reminding you that this life is not just about you feeling good today, but about someone else living better tomorrow. Every disciplined morning you commit to is a deposit into a future you may never personally enjoy. Every book you read instead of scrolling, every temptation you resist, every uncomfortable conversation you choose to have, every hour you invest into becoming sharper, wiser, more resilient is rewriting the script that was handed to you. And the irony is, the very moments that feel lonely are often the moments that are doing the most work for generations, because breaking cycles rarely looks glamorous. It looks boring, repetitive, exhausting, and unseen. But what you are really doing is changing the trajectory of people who will one day say, our family doesn't struggle with that anymore, not knowing that you were the one who paid the price for that sentence to be true. The danger is not failure. The danger is forgetting fit. Your actions have weight, because when you forget that others are tied to your discipline, your standards drop, your tolerance for excuses increases, and your urgency fades. And urgency is the fuel of transformation. Urgency is what separates people who talk about change from people who become change. Because once you understand that someone else's ceiling is being built by your habits today, procrastination starts to feel selfish, wasted potential starts to feel irresponsible, and comfort starts to feel expensive, because comfort costs time, and time is the only resource your bloodline can never get back. You are the bridge between what was and what could be, and bridges don't exist for their own benefit. They exist to be walked on, to carry weight, to endure pressure so others can cross safely. And no one thanks a bridge while they're crossing it. They just assume it's there, sturdy, reliable, strong. And that's how legacy often works: thankless in the moment, invisible in the process, but undeniable in the outcome. And if you ever wonder why life keeps demanding growth from you, keeps pushing you into discomfort, keeps challenging your identity, it's because stagnation would be a betrayal of everything that led up to you and everything that comes after you. This is why your mindset matters more than your mood, why your discipline matters more than your motivation, why your character matters more than your comfort, because moods fluctuate, but standards compound, and compounded standards shape generations. And when you choose to rise when it would be easier to stay down, when you choose to learn when it would be easier to blame, when you choose responsibility when it would be easier to complain, you are not not just upgrading your life, you are upgrading the default settings of your bloodline. You are normalizing excellence where limitation once lived. You are teaching people who aren't born yet what is possible simply by how you live today. There will be days you don't feel strong, days you don't feel inspired, days you question whether the effort is worth it. And on those days, you need to remember that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet consistency. Sometimes it's showing up again. Sometimes it's choosing to endure instead of escape, because endurance is how legacies are built. And every time you choose endurance, you are extending the runway for someone else to take off, someone who will start their journey further ahead because you refuse to quit early, because you refuse to let temporary discomfort dictate permanent outcomes, because you understood that your life is not an isolated event, but a link in a chain. And chains are only as strong as the links that refuse to break under pressure. Potential is inherited, but fulfillment is earned through sacrifice. And that distinction is where most lives quietly fall apart, because it's easy to admire what you were born with and much harder to honor it. Easy to talk about gifts and talents and far more difficult to bleed for them, because potential is passive. It arrives without effort, without consent, without instruction. But fulfillment is aggressive. It demands payment. It asks for time, discomfort, ego, convenience, and certainty. And most people want the reward of fulfillment while protecting the comfort of potential, not realizing that unused potential doesn't stay neutral. It turns into regret, resentment, and quiet self-betrayal over time. You didn't choose your capacity, but you choose whether it dies unused or becomes something dangerous, because potential is like fire. It can warm generations or burn a life down depending on how it's handled. And the tragedy isn't that people lack ability. The tragedy is that they refuse the sacrifice required to refine it. Because sacrifice is misunderstood. People think it means loss without return, but sacrifice is really an exchange, giving up who you are now for who you could become, trading short-term plea. Sure, for long-term power, trading comfort for clarity, trading ease for evolution. Every generation passes down raw material, instincts, intelligence, resilience, creativity, but raw material is useless without shaping, and shaping is violent. Shaping requires pressure, heat, repetition, and time, and no one escapes that process if they want fulfillment, because diamonds don't apologize for the pressure that made them, and neither will you once you understand that the discomfort you're avoiding is the very thing that would unlock you, because growth doesn't ask politely, it demands. And the demand is always the same. What are you willing to give up to become who you say you want to be? Sacrifice shows up in the quiet moments, not the dramatic ones. It shows up when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when you choose discipline over distraction, when you choose learning over leisure, when you choose progress over popularity, because fulfillment is built in rooms where applause never enters. And the reason most people never reach it is because they confuse visibility with value, thinking if the sacrifice isn't seen, it doesn't matter. But the truth is, the most valuable sacrifices are invisible. They reshape you internally before they ever reward you externally. You inherit potential like a seed, but seeds don't become forests by being admired. They become forests by being buried, watered, and broken open. And most people resist the burial. They resist the seasons where it feels like nothing is happening, not realizing that roots are forming in the dark, and roots determine how tall something can grow. And sacrifice is what grows roots. Sacrifice is what anchors you when storms come. Sacrifice is what keeps you standing when motivation disappears, because motivation is emotional, but sacrifice is structural. It builds the framework that fulfillment rests on. There is a cost to greatness that must be paid upfront, in isolation, in doubt, in fatigue, and the payment is non-refundable, because you don't get your time back. You don't get your comfort back. You don't get your old habits back. And that's why people hesitate, because sacrifice feels permanent, and it is, but so is fulfillment. And the difference is one feels heavy at the beginning while the other feels heavy at the end, and you are always choosing which weight you will carry, the temporary weight of discipline or the permanent weight of regret. Fulfillment doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accept excuses. It doesn't lower its standards because your circumstances are difficult, and that's not cruelty. That's respect, because life doesn't challenge what it doesn't believe in, and the level of sacrifice required is proportional to the level of impact possible, which means the reason the price feels high is because the ceiling is higher. And once you understand that, sacrifice stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like preparation, because you don't train lightly for a heavy load. You don't prepare casually for a serious mission. There will be moments when the sacrifice feels unfair, when you look around and see others enjoying what you're denying yourself, resting while you're grinding, indulging while you're restraining. And in those moments, you have to remember that timing is everything, because everyone pays eventually, either early with intention or later with pain. And delayed discipline doesn't eliminate costs. It multiplies it, because life collects interest on avoidance. And the longer you postpone sacrifice, the more expensive fulfillment becomes. What you give up shapes who you become. And the problem is, most people sacrifice the wrong things. They sacrifice their dreams to protect their habits. They sacrifice their future to preserve their comfort. They sacrifice their potential on the altar of approval, and then they wonder why fulfillment feels out of reach, not realizing that fulfillment only responds to intentional loss, the kind of loss that strips you down and rebuilds you stronger, sharper, clearer, more aligned, because sacrifice isn't about suffering. It's about alignment, removing what doesn't serve the mission so the mission can breathe. Inherited potential is neutral. It doesn't care whether you honor it or waste it, but fulfillment is personal. It remembers every choice, every delay, every moment you chose ease over excellence, and it responds accordingly, because fulfillment isn't old. It's earned day by day, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. And when you finally touch it, when you finally feel the weight of becoming who you were capable of being, you won't romanticize the struggle, but you will respect it, because you'll know that nothing valuable arrives without asking something valuable in return, and that the sacrifices you made didn't take from you, they revealed you. Comfort delays destiny, and discipline accelerates legacy, because comfort is a soft thief that steals quietly while promising peace. And discipline is a hard friend that demands everything now so tomorrow can give back with interest. And most people confuse comfort with safety, not realizing comfort is often the most dangerous place to live, because nothing grows there, nothing stretches there, nothing evolves there. And destiny does not visit places where effort is optional. Destiny responds to motion, to consistency, to standards that don't bend when feelings fluctuate, because feelings change daily, but discipline builds daily. And what builds daily eventually becomes permanent. Comfort whispers that you've done enough, that you deserve a break, that waiting won't hurt, that tomorrow will be better. And those whispers feel reasonable in the moment. But reasonable has never built anything remarkable, because destiny doesn't need reasonable people. It needs relentless ones. People who understand that comfort is not a reward. It's a delay, a pause button on progress that slowly turns into a stop button if you let it. Because every time you choose comfort over growth, you push destiny further down the road and tell legacy to wait its turn. Discipline doesn't care how you feel when you wake up. It doesn't negotiate with excuses. It doesn't lower the bar because life got hard. And that's why it works, because discipline removes emotion from execution. It creates structure where chaos wants to live. It creates direction where distraction wants to rule. And legacy is built on structure, not talent, because talent without discipline expires, but discipline compounds. And what compounds over time becomes generational. Comfort is seductive because it feels like relief, especially when life has already hurt you, especially when you've struggled, sacrificed, endured, and survived. But survival mode is not destiny mode. And the danger is getting so used to surviving that you forget you were meant to build, because survival keeps you alive, but discipline moves you forward. And forward is where legacy lives. Forward is where names last. Forward is where impact multiplies. And forward never comes from standing still. Discipline accelerates legacy because it creates habits, and habits create identity, and identity creates outcomes that repeat themselves. And when outcomes repeat, they become culture, and culture becomes inheritance, meaning the way you live today is teaching tomorrow what normal looks like. And comfort teaches normalcy, while discipline teaches excellence. And excellence doesn't happen once. It happens daily, quietly, consistently, long before anyone calls it success. Comfort wants you to rest before the work is done. Discipline teaches you to rest after the work is complete. And that difference determines whether your life becomes a story people tell or a lesson people learn from. Because unfinished work doesn't disappear. It waits. It shows up later as regret, as what ifs, as quiet disappointment. And discipline understands that doing the work now saves pie. later because pain is unavoidable, but its timing is negotiable. Legacy doesn't respond to bursts of motivation. It responds to sustained execution, and execution requires discipline when motivation disappears, because motivation is emotional. It rises and falls, but discipline is intentional. It stays. It shows up on empty days. It carries you through seasons where nothing seems to be working. And those seasons are where most people retreat into comfort, not realizing that resistance is confirmation that you're moving in the right direction, because comfort never challenges you, but destiny always will. The reason comfort delays destiny is because comfort asks nothing of you and destiny asks everything. And you can't answer a big call with a small commitment. You can't build something that outlives you with habits that barely sustain you. And discipline is the bridge between intention and impact. It's the difference between wanting to change things and actually changing them, because wanting costs nothing, but discipline costs daily. Discipline accelerates legacy by forcing clarity, because when your days are structured, your priorities become visible. And when priorities are visible, distractions lose power. And most people aren't lacking opportunity. They're lacking order. And order is created through discipline, not inspiration, because inspiration excites you, but discipline directs you. And direction is what turns effort into results that last. Comfort makes time feel abundant. Discipline reminds you that time is finite, and legacy is built by people who respect time enough to use it intentionally, who don't waste their best hours on their weakest habits, who don't trade their future for temporary relief, who understand that ease today often creates hardship tomorrow, and hardship today often creates ease tomorrow. And discipline is the daily choice to accept productive hardship instead of destructive ease. You don't accidentally build a legacy, you build it deliberately, and deliberation requires discipline, because discipline creates standards, and standards create behavior, and behavior repeated over time becomes reputation, and reputation becomes the story people tell long after you're gone. And comfort doesn't write stories, it erases them, because nothing memorable comes from playing it safe, from doing just enough, from choosing convenience over commitment. Discipline is not punishment, it's permission to become more than your circumstances, more than your moods, more than your past patterns. And once you understand that, discipline stops feeling restrictive and starts feeling empowering, because it gives you control, and control is the foundation of freedom, and freedom is what legacy requires. The freedom to choose long-term impact over short-term pleasure, the freedom to delay gratification for generational gain. Comfort delays destiny, because destiny requires friction, resistance, effort, and effort is uncomfortable by nature. But discipline trains you to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and that skill alone separates those who leave a mark from those who leave excuses, because life will test you regardless, but discipline determines whether those tests refine you or defeat you. And every time you choose discipline, you move faster toward the version of yourself that can carry legacy without dropping it. Legacy accelerates when discipline becomes identity, when it's no longer something you force, but something you are, when showing up is automatic, when excellence is expected, when standards don't depend on supervision. And that's when destiny stops feeling distant and starts responding, because destiny recognizes readiness, and readiness is built through disciplined action over time, not comfort-driven intention. And the moment you choose discipline over comfort consistently, you stop waiting for destiny and start meeting it head on. Your excuses echo backward, your actions echo forward. And that truth alone should make you sit with your choices differently, because every excuse you make doesn't just explain a moment, it reinforces a pattern. And patterns don't stay in the present, they travel through time. They attach themselves to identity. They become the stories families tell themselves about what's possible and what's not. And when excuses become familiar, they start sounding like logic, like realism, like protection, when in reality they are just fear wearing smarter language. Excuses always sound personal, but they're never private, because the way you justify inaction today becomes the permission slip someone else uses tomorrow. And you may never hear it, you may never see it, but your reluctance to push through discomfort teaches others that discomfort is a valid stopping point, and your willingness to stop becomes their starting line. Because human behavior is contagious, especially when it comes from someone we're connected to, someone we look up to, someone whose choices quietly define the ceiling of the group. Actions work differently. They don't explain themselves. They don't need speeches. They don't need to be defended, because results speak a language that travels further than words. words. And when you act with discipline, consistency, and courage, you create an echo that moves forward in time, influencing people you haven't met yet, setting standards without ever announcing them, because action doesn't argue, it demonstrates, and demonstration reshapes belief faster than any explanation ever could. Excuses reach backward because they're built from the past, from what hurt you, from what failed before, from what you didn't have, from what wasn't fair. And while all of that may be true, truth doesn't automatically equal permission, because understanding why something is hard doesn't mean accepting that it won't be done. And excuses often trap people in analysis, in over-identifying with their history, until history becomes an anchor instead of a lesson. Actions, on the other hand, reach forward because they are future-oriented, they are investments, they are bets placed on a version of life that doesn't exist yet, and that requires faith. Not religious faith, but practical faith. The kind that moves before certainty arrives. The kind that works without guarantees. And most people hesitate to act because action exposes them. It removes the safety of explanation. It puts results on the table where they can be judged. And excuses protect ego by keeping potential hypothetical. Excuses keep you intellectually busy while emotionally stagnant, because they give you something to say instead of something to show. And over time, that habit becomes dangerous, because talking about why you can't do something feels productive enough to quiet the discomfort of not doing it. And that's how years disappear, not through dramatic failure, but through well-reasoned delay, through logical avoidance, through convincing yourself that someday is safer than now. Actions feel risky because they create consequences, and consequences force growth, because once you act, you have to adapt, learn, adjust, and evolve. And that evolution is uncomfortable, but it's also the only path forward, because nothing changes until something moves. And excuses are stationary. They freeze you in place while convincing you that you're being cautious, responsible, or patient. The echo of excuses backward keeps old limitations alive. It keeps old fears relevant. It keeps old identities intact. And that's comforting in a strange way, because it means you don't have to become someone new. But comfort has never been the birthplace of transformation. And the moment you realize your excuses are rehearsing the past instead of building the future, they start to lose their power. Actions echo forward because they create proof, and proof reshapes memory, reshapes narrative, reshapes self-image, because once you've done something difficult, you know that about yourself. And that knowledge becomes fuel. It changes how you approach the next challenge and the one after that. And over time, those actions stack into a new story, one where resilience replaces hesitation and responsibility replaces justification. Excuses are easy to inherit and easy to pass down because they don't require effort. They only require agreement. And once a group agrees on an excuse, it becomes culture. It becomes the unspoken rule, and breaking that rule feels like betrayal, which is why so many people stay stuck, not because they can't act, but because acting would challenge the shared narrative, and standing alone feels heavier than staying limited. Actions are harder to inherit, but far more powerful to pass down, because they require someone to go first, someone to disrupt the pattern, someone to accept temporary isolation in exchange for long-term change. And that person often doesn't get celebrated in the moment, because their actions make others uncomfortable. They expose the cost of inaction, and discomfort always resists exposure. Excuses talk about circumstances, actions talk about commitment, and while circumstances influence starting points, they don't determine endpoints. And the people who change trajectories are never the ones with perfect conditions. They're the ones who act imperfectly, consistently, and courageously despite conditions. And those actions send a message forward that conditions are not destiny. Every time you act when it would be easier to excuse yourself, you weaken the grip of the past and strengthen the pull of the future, because the future responds to evidence, not intention. And action is evidence, evidence that you're serious, evidence that you're willing, evidence that you're capable of learning what you don't yet know. And capability grows through use, not through explanation. Excuses shrink your world because they limit your options to what feels safe, while actions expand your world by creating new data, new skills, new connections, new confidence. And expansion is always uncomfortable at first, because growth stretches identity, but once expanded, you can't fit back into the smaller version of yourself. And that's when the echo of action becomes irreversible. Your excuses echo backward because they reinforce who you've been, and your actions echo forward because they introduce who you're becoming. And every day you choose which echo you want to amplify, not through intention, not through planning, but through what you do when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when no one is holding you accountable, except the quiet awareness that something greater is waiting on the other side of action. The pain you avoid today becomes the struggle your bloodline repeats tomorrow, because pain doesn't disappear when ignored. It migrates, it changes shape, it finds new hosts, and when it isn't confronted consciously, it embeds itself into habits, beliefs, and behaviors that quietly pass themselves down as normal, as just the way things are. And most people don't realize that avoidance is not neutral, it is instructional. It teaches the next generation what to tolerate, what to fear, and what to run from. Avoided pain becomes inherited limitation, because what you refuse to face, your children learn to live with, and what you refuse to heal, they learn to normalize. And normalization is dangerous, because once pain feels normal, it stops triggering urgency. It stops demanding change. It becomes background noise, and background noise is easy to ignore while it slowly shapes identity, expectation, and outcome. Pain avoided today often shows up tomorrow as confusion, as anxiety, as financial instability, as emotional distance, as lack of discipline, as cycles no one can quite explain but everyone feels, because unprocessed pain doesn't stay contained. It leaks into decisions, reactions, and relationships, and those leaks become patterns, and patterns repeated long enough become legacy. Most people think they are protecting themselves by avoiding pain, but they are really postponing payment. And postponed pain always collects interest, because time doesn't heal what effort refuses to address. Time only hardens what's left untouched. And the longer pain sits unchallenged, the deeper it roots itself, until removing it requires more courage than facing it ever would have in the first place. Pain avoided looks like refusing difficult conversations, staying in familiar dysfunction, choosing comfort over growth, distraction over discipline, denial over responsibility, and each one feels small in the moment, but small choices repeated daily become structural weaknesses, and structures collapse generations later, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, under weight that could have been reinforced earlier. When you choose to face pain, you absorb impact so others don't have to. And that absorption is heavy, because healing hurts more than avoiding at first. Growth is more uncomfortable than stagnation initially, and accountability feels harsher than excuse making. But facing pain transforms it. It turns raw suffering into wisdom, into boundaries, into systems, into standards that protect people who come after you. Avoided pain becomes invisible instruction, teaching future generations how to cope by watching what you tolerate, not by listening to what you say, because behavior is louder than advice, and children inherit coping mechanisms long before they inherit language. They learn how to deal with stress, failure, conflict, and fear by observing how you respond, and avoidance teaches withdrawal, while confrontation teaches resilience. Pain you avoid emotionally often resurfaces relationally, showing up as distance, mistrust, control, or inconsistency. And those relational wounds don't end with you. They shape attachment styles, communication patterns, and emotional safety for generations. Because unresolved pain doesn't just hurt the individual, it distorts the environment around them. And environments shape people long before people realize it. Pain you avoid financially often becomes generational struggle, because avoiding discipline, learning, and responsibility today creates instability tomorrow, and instability becomes the default starting point for those who come after you, forcing them to spend their early years surviving instead of building, repairing instead of expanding, undoing instead of creating, and that delay compounds across time. Pain avoided in personal growth becomes inherited limitation in mindset, because when fear dictates your ceiling, that ceiling becomes familiar to others, and familiar ceilings feel natural, not restrictive, until someone finally challenges them. And challenging inherited ceilings always feels like rebellion, because it disrupts the comfort of shared limitation. Facing pain requires you to become the interruption, the one who says this stops here, not because you're stronger than everyone else, but because you're willing to feel what others avoided, to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it, to ask hard questions instead of repeating easy patterns. And that willingness changes trajectories, because pain confronted becomes information, and information creates options. Avoided pain keeps families reactive, always responding to crises instead of designing systems, while confronted pain creates proactive behavior. Because once you understand the source of struggle, you can build guardrails, routines, and standards that prevent its return. And prevention is the greatest gift you can give a future you'll never meet. Most generational struggle isn't caused by lack of love, it's caused by lack of healing, because people pass down what they know, and what they know is shaped by what they were willing or unwilling to face. And love without healing still repeats cycles, while healing transforms love into something that actually protects. Pain face doesn't disappear instantly, but it loses control, because once you name it, understand it, and work through it, it stops dictating behavior from the shadows. And shadow pain is the most dangerous kind, because it influences decisions without ever being questioned, while conscious pain can be processed, managed, and eventually resolved. Avoidance feels easier because it delays discomfort, but delay is deceptive because the discomfort returns amplified, heavier, and often multiplied across people who never chose it. And that's the real cost of avoidance. Not that you suffer, but that others inherit suffering they didn't create. When you face pain, you model courage, accountability, and growth. And those qualities become visible proof that struggle is not destiny, that healing is possible, that patterns can be broken, and proof is powerful because it gives future generations permission to choose differently without guilt. Pain avoided today becomes the struggle your bloodline repeats tomorrow, because avoidance teaches endurance of dysfunction, while confrontation teaches transformation. And transformation requires someone to go first, to feel deeply, to work consistently, to change intentionally, and to accept that healing is not glamorous, not quick, not easy, but necessary. Facing pain is an act of responsibility, not just to yourself, but to those connected to you by blood, name, and influence, because every healed wound becomes a closed door for generational struggle, and every avoided wound becomes an open invitation for it to return in another form, in another life, at another time. The choice is never between pain and no pain. It is always between pain now or pain later, between pain you choose or pain that chooses your descendants. And responsibility means choosing the pain that ends the cycle instead of the pain that extends it. When you rise, you don't rise alone, because elevation is never a solo event, even when the climb feels lonely. And every step upward pulls on invisible threads connected to people you may never meet, names you will never know, lives that will never be able to thank you directly, because progress is contagious in ways most people underestimate, and your growth quietly rearranges what is possible in rooms you're not even in yet. Rising changes more than your circumstances. It changes expectations, and expectations shape behavior long before opportunity appears, because when someone sees proof that elevation is possible, the internal conversation shifts from "can this be done" to "how do I do it?" And that shift alone can change the trajectory of a life. And you become that proof, not by announcing your rise, but by living it with consistency, integrity, and discipline. Most people think rising is about personal success, about recognition, status, or escape. But real rising is structural. It changes foundations. It creates new starting points. And when foundations change, everyone who builds on them benefits, because they no longer have to fight the same battles just to begin. And that head start compounds across time in ways that are impossible to measure. When you rise, you lift the ceiling of belief for others, because belief is often limited by exposure. And many people don't lack ambition. They lack examples. And your life becomes an example whether you intended to or not, because visibility isn't about fame, it's about proximity. The people closest to you watch how you handle pressure, failure, growth, and responsibility, and they internalize those lessons long before they ever articulate them. Rising responsibly means understanding that influence comes with weight, because what you normalize becomes acceptable, and what becomes acceptable becomes repeatable, and repeatable behaviors become culture, and culture outlives individuals, which means your standards today are shaping tomorrow's environment, and that environment will either empower or limit people who never had a say in how it was built. You lift names you've never met by choosing discipline when it would be easier to choose convenience, by choosing growth when it would be easier to choose familiarity, by choosing accountability when it would be easier to blame, because those choices send a signal forward that progress is possible without permission, that change doesn't require perfect conditions, that effort matters even when outcomes aren't immediate. Rising is costly because it requires separation, and separation is uncomfortable, because as you elevate, certain relationships, habits, and identities can no longer travel with you. And that loss can feel isolating. But isolation is often the space where impact is prepared, because you can't build something new while clinging to everything old. And letting go creates room for expansion. When you rise, you also disrupt patterns. And disruption is rarely celebrated at first, because patterns feel safe even when they're limiting. And your growth challenges the unspoken agreements people have made with mediocrity, which can create resistance, misunderstanding, or distance. But that resistance is often confirmation that something important is shifting. Rising lifts names you'll never meet, because progress rewrites narratives, and narratives shape identity, and identity shapes decisions. And when a narrative changes from people like us, don't do that to someone did it, so maybe I can too. The ripple effect begins. And that ripple doesn't stop at one person. It moves through families, communities, and generations, quietly but powerfully. Your rise becomes a reference point, a story told in fragments, a comparison made in moments of doubt, a reminder used in conversations you'll never hear. And that's how legacy works, not through monuments, but through memory, not through recognition, but through replication, because people imitate what feels real, and your lived example makes progress feel reachable. Rising also carries responsibility to stay grounded, because elevation without humility becomes disconnection, and disconnection breaks the bridge that allows others to follow. But rising with humility keeps the path visible. It keeps the process human. It shows that growth includes mistakes, learning, and adjustment, not perfection. And that honesty makes the journey feel accessible. When you rise, you don't just change outcomes, you change language, the way people talk about possibility, effort, and limits, because language reflects belief, and belief influences behavior, and behavior repeated becomes destiny. And your rise injects new words into old conversations, words like maybe, possible, next, and why not. You lift names you've never met by refusing to quit when quitting would be understandable, because perseverance teaches others that endurance is a skill, not a trait, something that can be developed rather than inherited. And that lesson alone can change how someone approaches adversity, shifting them from avoidance to engagement. Rising also means becoming visible to responsibility, because the higher you go, the more people are affected by your choices. And that awareness sharpens decision making, because you start thinking beyond immediate reward, beyond personal relief, beyond short-term comfort. And that expanded perspective is what separates selfish success from meaningful impact. Every disciplined habit you build becomes a shortcut for someone else. Every mistake you learn from becomes a warning sign they don't have to ignore. Every boundary you establish becomes permission for others to do the same. And that transfer of knowledge is one of the most powerful forms of lifting, because it reduces unnecessary suffering. When you rise, you also redefine normal, and normal is powerful because people gravitate toward what feels normal more than what feels exceptional. And by making growth, responsibility, and consistency normal in your life, you lower the psychological barrier for others to adopt those behaviors, because they no longer feel extreme, they feel expected. Rising lifts names you've never met, because it shortens the distance between potential and execution for others. It shows that the gap can be crossed, that fear can be managed, that progress can be sustained, and that proof becomes a compass for people navigating their own uncertainty. The most profound impact of your rise may never be visible to you, because it happens quietly, in private decisions, in moments of courage sparked by your example, in lives that change direction without ever intersecting with yours again. And that invisibility doesn't reduce its value, it amplifies it, because it means the impact isn't dependent on your presence. When you rise with intention, you become part of something larger than personal achievement. You become a link in a chain of progress, and chains don't move because of one link. They move because each link holds its weight. And your responsibility is not to carry the whole chain, but to be strong enough where you are so the chain can continue moving forward.